So this is the video that will not get any views whatsoever, but I really wanted to make it, because this underrated pirate is actually one of my favorites. Swan became a pirate for very particular and accidental reasons, proceeded to operate in some uncommon areas of the world, and would eventually fall victim for his own hubris. He almost circumnavigated the world, and ended his days as a Muslim in the Philippines. Unlike most pirates, we actually have eyewitness description of what he looked like. And let me tell you, Captain Swan was thick. He had the glutes. He was chonky. And this is his story. Because I want to tell it, bitches.
Oh, there was a little ship, and she sailed upon the sea, and the name of the ship was the Golden Vanity, and she feared she would be taken by the Spanish enemy, as she sailed upon the lowland, lowland, low, as she sailed upon the lowland sea.
The tragedy of Charles Swan is in many ways similar to the tale of Stede Bonnet. A seemingly innocent and eccentric man, turning to piracy through circumstance. Above all, Swan was known and admired for his diplomatic abilities and his way of coming up with out-of-the-box solutions. But our adventure doesn't actually begin with Captain Swan, but with a familiar face from some of my older videos, Basil Ringrose. 2 years prior, this clerk and cartographer had accompanied the infamous Bartholomew Sharp on his buccaneering expedition into the Pacific. Though Bass had survived multiple battles, personal duels, storms, starvation, a trial in London, and published a written account of it all, he failed to make any money from either the book or the voyage itself. Sharp had stolen most of that, the sexy bastard. But being down on his luck, Bass had no other option but go to sea again. This time he wasn't interested in risking his life as a buccaneer before the mast. Rather, he imagined some fat and lazy merchant to hire him for something easier. And preferably something with a higher salary. Enter the hero of our story, Captain Charles Swan. He was fat, happily married, and owned a 140-ton, 16-gun merchant ship, the Cygnet. A Cygnet is a young swan, by the way. This was just what Bass needed, and as it appears, he quickly managed to convince Captain Swan to undertake a voyage to the South Sea. Before Sharp's voyage, these waters had been largely unexplored by anyone but the Spanish. Now it was as if a whole new world had opened up for traders and pirates. A lot of money could be made on this new market. Bass was intimately connected to the South Sea. He had written a detailed account of this adventure and drawn up maps of the places he visited. The Swan could not refuse employing him as the Cygnet supercargo, essentially a commercial agent. Next up, Swan and Bass got hold of some investors. A group of very eminent merchants loaded the Cygnet with 500,000 pounds of worth of goods, giving them strict orders to only trade with the Spaniards or Indians. As shareholders, these merchants had a stake in Swan's future. He likewise acquired a commission from the Duke of York, telling him to neither give offense to the Spaniards nor receive any affront from them. So this wording left a lot of interpretation that would be abused. So in October of 1683, with a crew of only 20 men, Swan and Ringrose set off for what they hoped would be a profitable, but calm and kinda cozy adventure. How wrong they were. The Cygnet met up with another ship from London, the Nicholas, commanded by Captain Eaton, and the two decided to enter the Pacific together. Despite being outfitted as a merchant, Eaton's true intentions was to do a little stealing. Immediately after crossing the Straits of Magellan, the two ships were separated by a storm. The Cygnet arrived a bit later in the Spanish port of Valdivia, where Swan hoped to open up some profitable trade. Well, the Spanish weren't so eager. You see, this wasn't their first visit from English traders. 10 years prior, John Narborough had entered the Pacific together with a mysterious figure named Don Carlos as his guide. You see, Don Carlos claimed to be an expert navigator that had intimate knowledge of the entire South Sea. Surprise, he didn't. When Narborough arrived in Valdivia, the Spaniards appeared friendly. At first. Then Don Carlos was arrested. Narborough made several angry threats to have his colleague released, but it didn't work, so he just up and sailed back home. When Bartholomew Sharp and his buccaneer buddies came around 10 years later for another sort of trade, Don Carlos was still imprisoned. By now he had told so many crazy stories, including that he was an illegitimate member of the English royal family, and that the English wanted to occupy Valdivia, destroy the port of Callao, and totally dominate the South Sea shipping. The Spanish finally tired of Don Carlos and just strangled him to death. But his schizoid ramblings left a black imprint in their mindsets. The fact that every Englishman that had visited them since wanted to steal from them didn't exactly help their view of tourists and expats. So when Swan and Ringrose stopped by to trade, they weren't exactly well received, meaning that the Spanish started shooting at them, killing and wounding several men of the already small crew. Swan tried negotiating with the Spanish, and even went so far as to warn them of Captain Eaton's location and intentions. Whilst the Spanish did appreciate this, it did not help Swan standing with them. Instead, the Viceroy of Lima was alerted, and all the Pacific ports were prepared for buccaneer assaults. Swan had just mucked it up for everyone. The Signet sailed north, where Swan hoped to trade with the town of Nicoya. Instead, he found it toasted by a buccaneer named Peter Harris. His uncle was the same Peter Harris that had been killed in a sea battle near Panama during the Pacific adventure. Harris had marched across the isthmus in search of a ship, and was overjoyed to find fellow Englishmen, with a ship as fine as the Signet. Suddenly, Swan was facing a lot of pressure. His own men wanted money, revenge, and they were feeling jealous of these newcomers that had so easily gotten rich from just robbing the Spanish. Said buccaneers were likewise heavily armed and anxious for a ship. Perhaps a very certain ship. These two parties could easily join forces and just oust Swan from power. What would his wife and investors say then? So, Swan argued that he didn't have a choice but becoming a buccaneer. Of course, it was entirely legal. His commission gave him permission to right himself against Spanish affronts, which they certainly had done at Valdivia. He was so confident in this decision that he later refused a privateering commission from the French. There was the issue of making money. As buccaneers, they would split the profits evenly. However, since Swan owned the Signet himself, the crew agreed to compensate him for using it for buccaneering, paying him as many as 10 shares. Normally, buccaneer captains received only 2 shares. All of a sudden, this new job opportunity didn't sound so unappealing. Still, Swan had to worry about his investors back home. Not to mention, his wife. He wrote letters back home to his friends and investors, saying they would receive 10 shares of any prize money. He wasn't lying either. Judging by letters sent to his friends, Swan generally wanted to recompensate his investors, and was even willing to surrender himself to an English court of law. Once the voyage was complete, of course. As for his wife, he told her that his crew had forced him into buccaneering, ignoring a fact which I've overlooked until now. Charles Swan had once sailed with Sir Henry Morgan. 12 years prior, he had been one of the bloodthirsty buccaneers that had burned old Panama. Was he really so innocent then? Swan and Harris met with another buccaneer named Captain Davis, and they decided to join forces. Aboard Davis' ship were 2 old friends of Bass, Lionel Wafer and William Dampier. They were 2 fellow scholar buccaneers, and the 3 had all sailed with Bartholomew Sharp during his Pacific adventure. Dampier is actually not only one of the most important pirates, he's one of history's most important natural scientists, and I've made a video dedicated entirely to him, which you should go and watch after this one. Swan still had to dispose of the merchant goods stowed aboard the Signet. He decided to host a flea market on the main deck, where he sold off his goods to the willing crew of buccaneers. Everything that wasn't sold was either kept as ballast, or thrown overboard to make space for plunder. Still eager to sell the rest, Swan was contacted by a Spanish smuggler. The 2 set up a time and location and cast off. But you see, Swan had an astrologer aboard, because every sea captain needs someone to read their fortune. The night before the trade, the astrologer warned him about a fire. The morning of the trade, he told Swan to be careful. Indeed, when the Spanish drew close, they all jumped overboard. Their vessel was in reality a fire ship, and was headed straight for the Signet. They were just narrowly able to cut their cables and escape. While Swan thanked his astrologer for warning him, Dampier called him a fool for trusting the Spanish in the first place. Despite the promise of riches, things weren't looking good for the buccaneers. The Spanish refused to pay ransom for their occupied towns, and the buccaneers had to burn them without taking any loot. With food running low, they resorted to hunting. Now, Swan's men were kind of weirded out over this exotic selection of food. Swan urged them all to eat, cheerfully comparing the seals to roasted pigs, the boobies to hens, and the penguins to ducks. He said that these strange meats were the sweetest food he ever tasted. Being an old buccaneer himself, he knew that these men operated almost entirely on their stomachs. 2 buccaneers had been taken captive in the city of Panama and were awaiting execution. Swan and the captains hoped to exchange them for some Spanish prisoners. It was perhaps at his behest that they wrote a very interesting letter to the governor, telling him that, "By the help of God we will color your land, rivers and sea with Spanish blood of men, women and children." If that wasn't enough, the buccaneers had written 4 additional copies and distributed them amongst the civilians. Panic soon spread through the streets, and at plebeian behest, the governor had the prisoners exchanged. More and more buccaneers banded together with the fleet, until they formed a force of 10 sail, 52 guns, and 960 men. This was one of the largest pirate forces the South Sea had seen. Swan wrote eagerly to a friend in London that if the buccaneers received backing from the king, they might be able to conquer the entire kingdom of Peru. Their current goal was less ambitious, but it was still to take the silver fleet carrying treasure from Lima to Panama. Problem was that the Spanish were stronger. The fleet had 14 sail, 174 guns, and around 3,000 men. Of course, buccaneers had faced far worse odds. They just needed to use their brains, and they didn't. In the dark of night, the Spanish killed and relit the stern lamps of their ships, make it seem as if they were retreating. When dawn rose, the buccaneers realized that the Spaniards had moved into a superior fighting position, the weather gauge, with all their guns to bear. The buccaneers ran, and though the Spanish had been their prey, they now chased them all around the Bay of Panama. This was just humiliating, and when the buccaneers were safe, the accusation of cowardice began dropping, as per usual. First the French split from the English, and then the English split from the English. Captain Eaton sailed south, taking Lionel Wafer with him. The Signet under Captain Swan decided to sail north to Mexico. A large portion of the buccaneers joined him, including William Dampier. His initial crew of 20 had by now grown to maybe 150. Not bad, all things considered. The plan was to catch the Manila galleon as it arrived from East Asia, carrying untold riches of the Philippines and China. Well, they didn't find anything. Soon much of the crew fell sick with terrible illness, and Captain Swan himself laid on his deathbed. But miraculously, the madman somehow survived. Swan and his consort failed to catch the Manila galleon. The consort split away, and Swan resorted to small raids along the Mexican coast. The astrologer warned him of great danger and not to make landfall, but he decided to continue anyway. They camped inside an abandoned church, and night offered them no sleep, thanks to the ghostly wails of whatever was inside. Perhaps it was another warning. Several days later, they learned of a large force coming for them. Swan wanted to evacuate, but the more stubborn of his men decided to make a stand. 50 of them were ambushed and butchered. Swan was shocked at this horrific massacre, saying that the bodies were so cut and mangled that he scarce knew one man. Amongst them was the supercargo, Basil Ringrose. Having been cheated of his share by Bartholomew Sharp, he had unwillingly returned to the South Sea. He and Swan had hoped for a peaceful and profitable voyage, but Mexico is a thirsty country. Now he lay dead in the hot sand, where the blood of 1,000 Christs account for nothing. At this point, Captain Swan stunned his men with a new and innovative plan. Instead of continuing in Mexico, he wanted to cross the Pacific and plunder Spanish possessions in the East Indies. No pirate had attempted this before, and he tried to sell himself as a new Francis Drake. Swan managed to get William Dampier on his side, and together, the two of them convinced the crew that this was their only way of catching the Manila ship, right in its home port. However, it seems that Swan's plans were actually entirely different. In private, he told Dampier that he had no intentions of privateering in the East Indies. Rather, he wanted to find the best possible escape, back to England. He had tired of buccaneering and wanted to get out. There were two problems with the voyage. The first was distance. Provided they wouldn't get lost in the endless Pacific, the trip from California to Guam was approximately 6,000 miles. It would take around 50 days to travel. The next issue was having the food and water last that long. They had some salt fish, which was devoured in the next 3 days. For the rest of the voyage, they sustained themselves on a meager meal of maize porridge once a day. Dampier wrote that every man aboard the ship crowded around the quartermaster as he carefully measured out the day's rations. Amongst the eager and hungry were the ship's cat and 2 dogs, whom the crew refused to let starve. Don't even think about eating them. The crew loved their animals. Remember this. One man had been stealing from the food supply and was sentenced to 3 blows on his bare back with a rope from every crewman. Captain Swan struck first, and with violent example for the rest of them. Perhaps these events were changing him. It was only after the voyage that Dampier learned that if the crew had run out of provisions, they planned on killing Captain Swan and eating him. He was a rather chonky boy after all, or as Dampier described him, lusty and fleshy. Swan laughed in response, saying heartily that since Dampier was so skinny, eating him would have poisoned them. But this never came to pass, for the buccaneers had arrived on the island of Guam. A small dispatch with a priest rode out to seek contact with the signet. When Swan replied that they were Spaniards from Acapulco, the priest came aboard. When the priest realized that they weren't Spanish, but English buccaneers, it was already too late. He was now their prisoner. But Swan had no intentions of violence. He courteously conducted the priest to his own cabin, where they negotiated and paid for provisions. They learned that 40 months earlier, Captain Eaton had stopped by to pick a fight with the natives. This resulted in a violent uprising against the Spaniards, resulting in many casualties and the natives fleeing the island. The natives then contacted Swan in hopes of getting his help in expelling the Spanish, but he declined. He hoped that the governor would give him a commission to trade with the Spanish colony of Manila. It was now that tensions began to rise against the captain. As you know, the crew had 2 fine and well-beloved dogs aboard the Signet. These were of a rare English breed, and the Spanish governor wanted one for himself. Swan decided to give it away, much against the crew's protests. Secondly, the governor gave him the location of the Manila galleon. It had recently cast off with a small crew and fewer cannons, and Swan really could have taken and looted her. But since he wanted to improve his relation with the Spanish, he refused to do so. The priest convinced Swan of going to Mindanao in the Philippines. The plan was to get a privateering commission from the Muslim Sultan, who was at war with the Spanish. Though they were buccaneers, the Signet's crew were very squeamish about plundering without a commission. Swan agreed to the plan, since he figured he could use Mindanao as an escape route back to London. 3 weeks later, the Signet arrived in Mindanao. The Mindanaoans were hopeful that the English had arrived to protect them against the encroachment of the Dutch and Spanish. They mistook Captain Swan for a royal ambassador, as he stood gleaming on the quarterdeck, lavishly bedecked in his red coat with silver lacing. They were quite disappointed. Nonetheless, Swan was allowed an audience with the Sultan of Mindanao, Raja Laut. In return, Swan gifted the Sultan 3 yards of scarlet cloth, 3 yards of gold lace, a Turkish scimitar, and a pair of pistols. As Swan entered the palace, he had his men play trumpets and fly a flag at the boat's head. After a dinner of boiled chicken and rice, Raja Laut helped guide the Signet to a safe mooring, where she was repaired and maintained. Raja Laut and Captain Swan would dine together every day, and this royal pampering was getting to the captain's head. He began to punish his men for the least offenses, merely to show his power to the Mindanaoans. Swan thought he was as good or even better than the Sultan himself. Raja Laut did not appreciate this. Together with 14 buccaneers, he planned to host a hunting trip where Captain Swan would be deceived and detained. Dampier warned the captain of this ploy, and as a response, Swan began angrily shit-talking the Sultan. Of course, he didn't dare say anything to his face. Dampier had previously admired Swan, but now saw him as a coward. He wrote that Swan had become so puffed up by the favor of a poor, indignant prince that now he was clear another man than he had formerly been. The mood lightened up on Christmas Day, when Captain Swan announced a celebration aboard his Signet. The crew expected him to heed their complaints, or announce their leaving of Mindanao, preferably with a cargo of rich spices which they could sell for a high profit. Instead, the captain just had a bit of food, and then he returned ashore. Even Dampier had enough. He and 15 others attempted to escape in a piragua. Swan discovered them and seized the boat. When they tried again, he just seized the boat again. The straw that broke the camel's back was when the ship's gunner decided to search Swan's cabin and discovered his journal. Well, it was less like a journal and more like a catalogue of grievances against pretty much the entire crew. The crew announced that they were deposing Swan and leaving him behind. There were some back and forth negotiations and empty promises, but Swan never even bothered to come out and meet the men himself. Despite losing his faith, Dampier did feel a bit sorry for Captain Swan, as he left him and 40 other men behind on the foreign island of Mindanao. Several months later, the Signet returned to Mindanao after a fruitless tour to Australia. A young nobleman came aboard and told him the fate of Captain Swan. The captain had become an officer and battled against the enemies of Raja Laut. However, army life was no life for him, and the captain wanted to get out. But fears of the Sultan discovering this prevented him from doing anything. Dampier began to feel bad for his old captain and concocted a rescue attempt. The Signet's new captain quickly discovered and squashed his plan. The Signet sailed away for good. 3 years later, Swan finally mustered his courage. He had saved up some money, including the shares intended for his investors. With this he planned to buy passage aboard a Dutchman and escape Mindanao. Raja Laut learned of the scheme and sent out his headhunters. At the mouth of the Mindanao River, Swan was cornered. The warriors capsized his boat and speared him to death. During Swan's long voyage, Charles II had died and the Duke of York was crowned the new king. That was the man that had offered Swan's commission. One can wonder what would have happened had Swan returned to London. The king might surely have pardoned him, but would investors have forgiven him for returning with so little money? What would his wife have said? Perhaps these questions played a part in why he delayed his escape for so long. The tragedies of classical literature are defined by its aristocratic hero, whom, despite possessing many noble traits, possess those negative ones that ultimately leads to their own downfall. Jealousy, hubris, anger. The purpose of the tragic ending was for the audience to reach catharsis, an extreme emotional state resulting in rejuvenation. There was something to learn from tragic heroes like Agamemnon or Medea, and certainly from the tragedy of Captain Swan. Huge thanks to my generous supporters over on Patreon. Cole Freer, Max Dweck, 1660, Michael Jans, Rachel Lockar, Dyer, Ted11, Flintlock, Red Hate, George Skull, and the Part of Jesus. Now, if you want to support me monetarily, please check out the links to PayPal and Patreon in the video description below. Otherwise, do give the video a like and a comment and share it with a friend. I'm not asking you to, I'm telling you to, so do it. Thank you for watching. Cheers!